Welcome to session 30 of our class on the Conquest. Um, we are in 1 Kings chapter 20, and we see that Ahab is a weak man who destroyed himself and his family because he allowed his evil wife Jezebel to turn him into a monster. The name Jezebel is familiar to people today and has even made it into the dictionary. Under the entry Jezebel, you will find the definition, an evil, shameless woman. To call a woman a Jezebel is to put her on the lowest level of society. The prophet Elijah described the man accurately when he told Ahab, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." The chapters of 20, 21, and 22 describe four events in Ahab's life. 3 battles with the Arameans and a scam to grab a piece of land that involved an illegal trial and several murders. Because he did not follow God, Ahab was enslaved to sin. But the wages of sin is death, and Ahab received his wages with dividends. Chapter 20, verses, the whole chapter, this is the first of 2 occasions when wicked King Ahab showed a glimmer of spiritual understanding. Israel was just coming out of 3 years of famine when Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, decided to attack and take advantage of their plight. King David had defeated these northern nations, which are called Syria in older translations and Aram in the newer translations, but these nations had gradually regained their independence. Another factor in Ben-Hadad's attack was the growing strength of Assyria in the north. Ben-Hadad wanted to control the trade routes through Israel because he had lost the northern routes to Assyria. And he also wanted to be sure that Israel would provide men and weapons in case of an Assyrian invasion. In verses 1 through 12, the 32 kings who allied with Ben-Hadad were the rulers of northern city-states whose safety and prosperity depended a good deal on the strength of Syria. We aren't told how long the siege of Samaria lasted, but Syria ultimately brought Ahab to the place of submission. First, Ben-Hadad demanded Ahab's wealth, as well as his family, and Ahab agreed. Ben-Hadad planned to hold the family hostage just to make sure that Ahab did not back out of his agreement. Instead of Ahab calling for Elijah or another prophet and seeking the help of God, he quickly gave in. Ben-Hadad wasn't satisfied with this arrangement and wanted more, but his covetousness led to his defeat. In addition to taking the king's wealth and the royal family, Ben-Hadad wanted to send officers to search all the royal buildings and take whatever they wanted. Agreeing with this request was much too humiliating for proud Ahab, so he and his advisors refused to accept it. When he received Ahab's message, Ben-Hadad was probably drunk and feeling very brave because he made an unwise decision. He could have gotten most of what he wanted without sacrificing a single soldier, but now he made an oath to grind Samaria to powder, and he had to live up to his boast. To his credit, Ahab replied with a familiar proverb that could have applied to him as much as to Ben-Hadad. It's the equivalent of, "Don't count your chickens before they hatch." In verses 13 through 21, in opposing Ben-Hadad, Ahab had nothing to stand on. But God in his grace sent him a message of hope. The Lord would give Ahab the victory. the Lord wasn't doing this because Ahab deserved it, but because he wanted to honor his own name before the wavering king of Israel and his people. As he did on Mount Carmel, so Jehovah would do on the battlefield. He would demonstrate that he alone is God. We commend Ahab for receiving the promise and asking for further instructions. Perhaps Jezebel wasn't home that day to influence him the wrong way. Following the example of Solomon, Ahab's father Omri had divided the kingdom of Israel into a number of political districts, each in the charge of a provincial leader who was also an army officer. The Lord selected these leaders to lead the attack against Syria, and Ahab was to lead the small army of 7,000 men. They went out at noon, knowing that Ben-Hadad and his officers would be eating and drinking and be in no condition to fight a battle. Even when Ben-Hadad's scouts reported that a company of men was approaching the Syrian camp, the Syrian king wasn't afraid but told the guard to take them alive. The military strategy for capturing prisoners would be different from that for destroying an invading army. So Ahab's men caught the Syrian guards by surprise and proceeded to wipe out the Syrian army. Instead of measuring the dust of Samaria as he had threatened, Ben-Hadad jumped on his horse and escaped with his life. But because Ahab believed God's word and acted upon it, God gave him a great victory. In verses 22 to 30 of 1 Kings 20, another anonymous prophet spoke to Ahab and cautioned him to strengthen his forces and be prepared for another invasion. While Ahab was listening to God's message, Ben-Hadad was listening to his officers explain Syria's great defeat. They were healing their king's wounded pride, while at the same time protecting their own lives. They explained, or you might say lied, that their great army wasn't at fault. The defeat was the fault of the terrain. The gods of the Syrians were gods of the plains, while Israel's God was a god of the hills. Change the location and Syria would have the victory. Well, we now have a different scenario, because not only was the enemy challenging God's people, but he was challenging God himself. This was the Mount Carmel contest all over again, and the Lord wouldn't let it go unchallenged. Jehovah is the Lord of all the earth. He sent another man of God to assure Ahab of victory, but only because he wanted Ahab, the army of Israel, and the men of Syria to know that Jehovah alone is God. The Lord gave Israel victory on the battlefield, and when the enemy fled into the city of Aphek, God sent an earthquake and killed 27,000 Syrian soldiers. By the power of God, Ahab won a second great victory. Well, in chapter 20, verses 31 to 43, we see Ahab disobeying God's commands. You know, when God sent King Saul to fight the Amalekites, as we saw back in 1 Samuel, he made it clear that he wanted the Israelites to completely destroy their enemy. Saul disobeyed the Lord and as a result lost his kingdom. Well, the Lord must have given a similar command to King Ahab, but he too disobeyed. Ahab won the battle, but lost the victory. What the enemy couldn't accomplish with their weapons, they accomplished with their deception. If Satan can't succeed as the lion who devours, he will come as a serpent who deceives. Even Joshua fell into a similar trap of being deceived in Joshua chapter 9. Ben-Hadad's officers were clever men who knew that it was worth the risk to appeal to Ahab's pride. God had given the victory, but Ahab would take the credit and claim the spoils. In their dress and their attitude, the officers pretended to show humble submission to Ahab as he waited in his chariot. Excuse me again. Ahab certainly enjoyed the honor that he was receiving after the great victory, but not once did he give the glory to God. To hear that Ben-Hadad was his servant made his heart glad, and he was more than willing to spare the man's life. Later, Hazael would kill Ben-Hadad and become the king of Syria, as we will see in 2 Kings chapter 8. Well, Ben-Hadad immediately entered into a treaty with Ahab and gave back to Israel the cities that his father had taken in 1 Kings chapter 15. He also gave Ahab permission to sell Israel's produce and other things in the market at Damascus, which amounted to a trade agreement. Now, that the king of Israel should make such a treaty with the enemy is remarkable. But Ahab had no convictions except those of his wife, and he always took the easy way out of any situation. Furthermore, he needed the support of Aram in case the Assyrians could or should decide to move south. This treaty lasted 3 years. Well, the Lord couldn't allow Ahab to disobey and get away with it, so he instructed one of the sons of the prophets to confront the king about his sin. Knowing that he would have to catch Ahab by surprise to get his attention, the man wisely set up an action sermon that would arouse the king's interest. The young man told a fellow servant about God's orders and asked him to strike him with a weapon, but the man refused. We can understand a friend not wanting to injure another, but like Ahab, the young prophet was disobeying God, and it cost him his life. This certainly put the fear of God into the others, because the next one that the young man approached was only too willing to comply. Well, disguised as a wounded soldier, he was ready to deliver his message. Well, in those days, a person could approach the king to help decide matters that needed legal clarification. And when Ahab saw this quote-unquote injured soldier sitting by the side of the road, his curiosity was aroused. Now we have a replay of Nathan's approach to David after David committed adultery with Bathsheba. For just as David determined his own sentence, so Ahab announced his own guilt. Hearing that the soldier had lost an important prisoner of war and would have to forfeit his life or pay an enormous fine of 75 pounds of silver, the king replied, "So shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it." The king could have granted the man a pardon and saved his life, but he preferred to let him die. But in so doing, Ahab was declaring his own guilt and passing sentence on himself. The man that judged Ahab now became Ahab's judge and announced that one day the Syrians would slay Ahab. But instead of repenting and seeking the Lord's forgiveness, Ahab went home and pouted like a child. In chapter 21, verses 1 through 16, we see Ahab breaking God's laws. Ben-Hadad was the man Ahab should have killed, but he set him free. And Naboth was the man Ahab should have protected, but Ahab killed. When you sell yourself to do evil, you call evil good and good evil. You call light darkness and darkness light. The infamous episode of Naboth's vineyard reveals the lawlessness of King Ahab and his evil wife Jezebel. Consider the sins they committed, and consequently the commands of God that they disdained and disobeyed. First, they committed idolatry. The first 2 commandments in the 10 commandments declare that the Lord is the only true God, and that true worshipers do not worship and serve other gods, whether things in God's creation or things they make themselves. Jezebel brought Baal worship into Israel, and Ahab permitted it to spread throughout the land. When you turn away from truth, it's evidence that you're believing lies. Then you start loving lies, and before long, you're controlled by lies. Second, Ahab and Jezebel committed covetousness. They had a summer palace at Jezreel, but the king couldn't enjoy it fully without a garden. Powerful people acquire one thing after another, but in all their acquiring, there's never any real satisfaction. Henry David Thoreau said, "Superfluous wealth can buy superfluities only. Money is not required to buy one necessity of the soul." Well, the king wanted Naboth's vineyard because he coveted a garden convenient to the palace. "Thou shalt not covet" is the last of the Ten Commandments, but perhaps it's the most difficult one to obey. Even more, a covetous heart often leads us to disobey all the other commandments of God. The first 9 commandments focus on forbidden outward conduct, making and worshiping idols, stealing, murdering, and so on. But this commandment deals primarily with the hidden desires of the heart. It was this commandment that the wealthy young ruler refused to acknowledge when he looked into the law, Matthew 19:14 through 30. Ahab masked his covetousness by first offering to buy the vineyard or trade it for another piece of property. It was a reasonable offer, but Naboth was more concerned about obeying God's word than pleasing the king or even making money. Naboth knew that the land belonged to the Lord and that he loaned it to the people of Israel to enjoy as long as they obeyed his covenant. All property had to be kept in the family, which meant that Naboth was forbidden to sell his land to the king. Displaying his usual childishness, Ahab went home, went to bed, and pouted. Well, third, Ahab and Jezebel committed the sin of false witness. "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor" is the 9th commandment, and emphasizes the importance of speaking the truth, whether in court or over the back fence. Truth is the cement that holds society together, and when truth is gone, everything starts to fall apart. Jezebel was a resolute woman who never allowed the truth to stand in the way of what she wanted. So she fabricated an official lie on official stationery, sealed with the official seal. But no amount of royal adornment could change the fact that Ahab and Jezebel were breaking God's law. What right did Jezebel have to write Naboth's death warrant? Her husband was king. Since she came from Phoenicia, she had the Gentile view of kingship, which included being important, getting what you want, and using your authority to take care of yourself. Well, Samuel warned about this kind of ruler in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And Jesus cautioned his disciples not to follow that philosophy of governing, but to serve the people in love. Matthew 20:20 through 28. A true leader uses his authority to build the people up, while a dictator uses the people to build his authority. And people are expendable. That's the way Jezebel and Ahab were thinking. Jezebel even threw in some religion and told the local authorities to proclaim a fast. If you can sugarcoat your scheme with something religious, the people will quickly accept it. But no matter how legal and spiritual that royal edict may have looked, in the sight of God it was a lie, and God judges liars. Everything that God hates, Ahab and Jezebel did. Look at Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. "There are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among brothers. Well, fourth, as we have already noted, Ahab and Jezebel committed murder. The procedure Jezebel outlined was in agreement with the law, but the accusation was false. The witnesses were liars, and the judges had been bought off by royal intimidation. In every town there were men of Belial, worthless fellows, who would do anything for money or just to become important. Nobody but Ahab and possibly Jezebel heard Naboth's refusal to sell, and there was nothing in his words that could be interpreted as blasphemy. To curse God was a capital crime, and cursing the king was dangerous because he was God's appointed ruler. Well, fifth, Ahab and Jezebel broke the commandment, "You shall not steal." The weak rulers in Naboth's city followed Jezebel's orders. They conducted their illegal trial. They took Naboth and his sons outside the city and stoned them. Nobody in the family was alive who could inherit the land, so Ahab felt he was free to take it. The officers notified Jezebel, but not Ahab, of the execution. So it's obvious who had the power in the royal family. But the land didn't belong to Ahab, and the law says, "You shall not steal." The vineyard hadn't even belonged to Naboth. It belonged to the Lord. So in reality, Ahab was stealing property from God. If ever two people were guilty of blaspheming God and breaking his laws, it was Ahab and Jezebel, and judgment was about to fall. This brings us to chapter 21, verses 16 through 29. Amos 3 and verse 7 says, "Surely the Lord does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets. We have heard nothing from or about Elijah since he called Elisha to be his successor. But now God brings his servant into the center stage to confront the king. As he always does when he gives an assignment, he told Elijah just what to say to the evil king. Ahab had shed innocent blood, and his guilty blood would be licked up by the dogs. What a way for the king of Israel to end his reign. Well, previously, Ahab had called Elijah the troubler of Israel back in chapter 18 and verse 17. But now he makes it more personal, and he calls the prophet my enemy. Actually, by fighting against the Lord, Ahab was his own enemy and brought upon himself the sentence that Elijah pronounced. Ahab would die dishonorably, and the dogs would lick his blood. Jezebel would die and be eaten by the dogs. All of their posterity would eventually be eradicated from the land. They had enjoyed their years of sinful pleasure and selfish pursuits, but it would all end in judgment. Well, instead of going home to pout, Ahab actually repented. Now, what his wife thought about his actions isn't recorded, but the Lord who sees the heart accepted his humiliation and told it to his servant. The Lord didn't cancel the announced judgments, but he postponed them until the reign of Ahab's son Joram. Ahab was slain on the battlefield, and the dogs licked his blood at the pool of Samaria. Because of the postponement of the judgment, the dogs licked his son Joram's blood on Naboth's property, just as Elijah predicted. Later events proved that Ahab's repentance was short-lived, but the Lord at least gave him another opportunity to turn from sin and obey the word. How much more evidence did Ahab need? But the influence of his wife couldn't easily be broken, For when Ahab married her, he sold himself into sin. This brings us to chapter 22. At this point, we are introduced to the godly king Jehoshaphat, who was king of Judah. A summary of his reign is found in chapter 22, verses 41 through 50, and even more fully in 2 Chronicles chapters 17 through 20. He followed in the way of David, and he sought to please the Lord. He sent teaching priests throughout the land to explain God's law to the people, and he assigned the other priests to serve as faithful judges to whom the people could bring their disputes. God gave Judah peace, and Jehoshaphat took advantage of this opportunity to fortify the land. He was a good king, and he was a godly leader. But he got involved in 3 costly compromises. The first was the bride compromise, when he married his son to a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. This led to what we call the battle compromise, when Jehoshaphat got entangled in affairs of his son's father-in-law when Syria attacked Israel. Ahab's evil influence affected the reign of Jehoshaphat's grandson Ahaziah, and the battle compromise almost cost Jehoshaphat his life. The third compromise was what can be called the boat compromise, when Jehoshaphat foolishly joined forces with Ahab's son Ahaziah and tried to get rich by importing foreign goods. The Lord wrecked his fleet and rebuked him for his sinful alliance. One of Jehoshaphat's great achievements was the defeat of the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites, a great force that attacked Judah in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. The king humbled himself before the Lord, called for a nationwide fast, and encouraged the people to seek the face of the Lord. At a mass meeting in Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat prayed for God's guidance and help, reminding the Lord of his covenant with Abraham and God's acceptance of Solomon's prayer when he dedicated the temple. If the people would look toward the temple and pray, God promised that he would hear and answer. The Lord could see the great army approaching, and the king asked him to judge them. The prayer was followed by a declaration of the word from Jahaziel. He assured the king and his people that the Lord would indeed intervene and give Judah victory. The battle is not yours, but God's, according to verse 15. The king and the people believed the Lord's promise and praised him even before the battle started. The next day, Jehoshaphat sent the army out with the singers at the very front. Yes, I said singers, not slingers. Not the ones with slings and stones, but ones who were singing. He put them at the very front. God caused the 3 armies to fight among themselves and destroy themselves, leaving the spoils of war from the army of Judah. Well, the army had worshipped God before the battle and at the time of the battle, and now they worshipped him at the temple after the battle. Faith, prayer, and worship are great weapons. In chapter 22, the writer of 1 Kings focused primarily on the battle compromise, verses 1 through 6. When after 3 years, Ben-Hadad hadn't kept his agreement to give Israel back the cities that his father took, Ahab decided that it was time to fight Syria and take them back. Jehoshaphat's son, as we said, was married to Ahab's daughter. So Jehoshaphat decided to be friendly toward Ahab and help him fight his battles. Excuse me. He was disobeying the Lord when he took this step. But one compromise often leads to another. As the descendant of David, Jehoshaphat should have kept his distance from Ahab and never allowed the Davidic line to mingle with that of Ahab. All the court prophets who were paid to agree with the king assured Ahab that he would win the battle, but Jehoshaphat was wise enough to ask Ahab for some word from the Lord. Yes, there was a prophet of the Lord in Israel, and he was where true prophets are often found, in prison. Ahab sent for his enemy Micaiah, and while the two kings were waiting, the prophets put on quite a demonstration. Zedekiah, who seemed to be their leader, made some iron horns to illustrate how Israel would push back and gore the Assyrians and win the battle. All the other prophets agreed and shouted their approval. But it is impossible to win a war, even with an enthusiastic attitude, when God has decreed otherwise. And one note here is that we call these men prophets, but actually they are false prophets, the ones who are telling the king, yes, go up, you will defeat the enemy. When in fact, God had not said that. Well, Ahab ignores God's warnings. Micaiah was under a great deal of pressure to agree with the false prophets and assure Ahab that he would defeat Syria. Not only was Micaiah outnumbered 400 to 1, but the officer who brought him, the officer who brought him to the two kings warned him to agree with the majority. Well, often in Scripture, it's the minority that's being faithful to God, and Micaiah was determined to be faithful, not popular. The sight of the two kings on their thrones, dressed in their royal robes, must have been impressive, but it didn't sway Micaiah. His words in verse 13 were spoken in sarcasm, and Ahab knew it. But Ahab's reply wasn't honest. He was just trying to impress Jehoshaphat and make him think that he really did want to know and do God's will. Well, the Lord had given Micaiah two visions, both of which announced judgment to King Ahab. In the first, he saw Israel wandering helplessly and hopelessly, like sheep without a shepherd, obviously a description of a nation without a leader. Jesus used this image to depict the Jewish people in the New Testament times, who did not have spiritual direction from the leaders of Israel at that time. Well, Ahab got the message. He would be killed in the battle. The second vision explained how this would be accomplished. A lying spirit would give Ahab false confidence, so he would enter the battle. That the God of truth should allow a lying spirit to accomplish his work is a puzzle to some people, but it's no different from God permitting Satan to attack Job, or to allow Judas to betray Jesus in John chapter 13. We are free will beings with the power of choice, and God allows people to do what they choose and suffer the consequences for doing so. With the pure, you will show yourself pure, and with the devious, you will show yourself shrewd, says Psalm 18 and verse 26. Well, Ahab was fighting against God. The Lord knew Ahab and allowed him to believe what he wanted to believe. Ahab was a consummate liar, and the Lord dealt with him according to his character. Well, God did not lie to Ahab. Quite the contrary. Through the lips of Micaiah, he told the truth and gave Ahab fair warning of what lay ahead. The fact that God warned Ahab before the battle clears the Lord of the charge of being guilty of his death. A much greater mystery is why a godly man like King Jehoshaphat went into the battle at all and risked his life. Ahab ordered the true prophet to be taken back to prison and given bread and water, as if punishing the prophet would change his mind. The test of a true prophet was the actual fulfillment of his words, and Micaiah knew this. That's why his parting message to Ahab was, "If you return in peace, or if you return safely, the Lord has not spoken by me." Well, how could King Jehoshaphat not discern what Ahab was doing to him? If Ahab had put a target on Jehoshaphat's back, he would not have made it easier for the enemy to kill him. If Jehoshaphat had died, then his son would have taken the throne, and Ahab's daughter would have been the Jezebel of Judah. If Ahab then united the two thrones and blended the Davidic line with his own line, what would have happened to the Davidic covenant and the Messianic line? But God is sovereign in all things, and he protected Jehoshaphat, while at the same time allowing a random arrow to hit an opening in Ahab's armor and kill him. Well, Ahab was disguised and yet was killed, while Jehoshaphat was in his royal robes and never touched. Ahab had set the king of Syria free when he should have destroyed him. And now the Syrians killed Ahab. Micaiah's prophecy was fulfilled, and so were the prophecies of Elijah. Ahab's son Ahaziah took the throne and continued the evil ways of his father and mother. He reigned only 2 years, and his brother Joram, or in some translations Jehoram, succeeded him. The prophecy about the dogs licking blood on Naboth's property was actually fulfilled in the death of Joram. This brings us to the end of 1 Kings. But before we leave 1 Kings, I want to kind of review and see about some final lessons that we might get from this book. First, we have some reflections on responsibility. You know, responsibility is not a curse. It's a blessing. Adam and Eve had work to do in paradise before sin came into the world. And the perfect Son of God worked as a carpenter before he began his public ministry. Booker T. Washington said, "Few things help an individual more than to place responsibility upon him and to let him know that you trust him." After killing his brother Abel and lying about it, Cain asked, "Am I my brother's keeper?" He was trying to dodge both responsibility and accountability, a practice that's becoming very popular today. When Adam and Eve sinned, they ran and hid from God, and when they were confronted with their sin, they blamed others. Finally, they had to take the responsibility for what they had done, and with responsibility came hope and promise. Irresponsible people may run away, make excuses, cover up, or blame others. But if they do, they will never know the meaning of healthy character, integrity, a clear conscience, and the joy of walking with God. 1 Kings begins with the death of King David, and it ends with the death of King Ahab. And between those two events, many other people either succeeded or failed, lived or died, because of decisions that were either responsible or irresponsible. The world of David and Ahab was nothing like our world today in many, many ways. But human nature hasn't changed, and the basic principles of life are quite stable. We ought to be able to reflect on what we've learned from 1 Kings and draw some practical conclusions for life today. The first practical conclusion that I think we should get from this is concerning David and the idea that one person can make a difference. You know, the more you ponder the life of David, with all of his problems, and all of his good, the more you see his greatness. He was born with leadership ability, courage, and practical common sense. His predecessor, King Saul, almost destroyed the nation, but David accepted the difficult responsibility of putting it back together again and building it into a mighty kingdom. David defeated Israel's enemies, collected great treasures for building the temple, organized the army, the government, and the ministry at the sanctuary. He wrote songs for the Levites to sing, and he even invented musical instruments for them to play. Well, God's covenant with David assured Israel of a king forever and was ultimately fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ into the world. It was because of his promise to David that the Lord kept one of his descendants on the throne during the years of Judah's decline. Throughout the history of the monarchy, God measured every king against David, at least the kings of the southern kingdom. And though some of them were exceptional, none of them quite reached the level of David. One person can make a difference if that person is willing to accept responsibility and walk with God. Anybody can run with the crowd, but when God finds individuals who are willing to stand alone if necessary, he goes to work and he builds leaders. The words of Dr. Lee Roberson have echoed for many years. Everything rises or falls with leadership. The next practical conclusion that we want to take from 1 Kings concerns Solomon. And from Solomon we learn that success often leads to failure. You know, it's good to have the things that money can buy, provided you don't lose the things that money can't buy. Solomon was a brilliant man who could discuss everything from how to grow herbs to how to build fortresses. Yet he made a mess out of his life, and he paved the way for the division of the kingdom. During the golden age of Solomon, the nations marveled at his wisdom and envied his wealth, and even perhaps envied his many wives. But Solomon himself turned out to be a hollow man who forsook the Lord. He was perhaps the wisest fool in Bible history. When you read between the lines, you find that his living in luxury, surrounded by glamour and pleasure, introduced into Israel the viruses that eventually ate the spiritual heart out of the nation. Yes, we need education, but we also need to ask God for the wisdom to use it as we should. We also need money for food, clothing, and shelter. But to acquire money just for money's sake is to surrender to covetousness and become so concerned about prices that we ignore values. Solomon was irresponsible in many areas of his life. And his son Rehoboam, he inherited some of that mindset and ended up dividing the nation. God made a leader out of David by sending him out to care for sheep, by challenging him with a lion, a bear, and a giant, forcing him to run for his life for 10 years, and making him wait for the promised throne. Solomon grew up pampered and protected. He could have used a few years' service in the wilderness. By accumulating wives and horses and wealth, he brought peace to the nation, but it was a peace purchased at the price of obedience to the law of God. There's no virtue in ignorance and poverty, but there's no magic in knowledge and wealth. The government leaders tell us if people were just smarter and richer, we'd solve society's problems. Well, people do become smarter and richer, and they create a whole new set of problems. One man once said, "When I was a kid, we'd go down to the railroad yard and steal things from the freight cars. Now, a fella goes to university and learns how to steal the whole railroad." People are so smart that they can sit at a computer keyboard and rob a bank thousands of miles away. Most of the time, humanity does not change. The third practical consideration that I want us to take away from 1 Kings is that national strength and national character begin in the home. If David had displayed in his home the kind of discipline and strength that he showed on the battlefield, Jewish history might have been different. Part of the problem lay with his having too many wives, plus the fact that it isn't always easy for the children of celebrities to grow up normally. But whatever the causes, some of David's children turned out really bad, and what they were and what they did affected the nation. According to Genesis 3, Satan came as a liar, and he's been attacking ever since. According to Genesis 4, he came as a murderer, and his second target was the human family. He encouraged Cain to be envious and angry so that Cain would kill Abel. It's been said that in the modern home, the stereo and the TV set are better adjusted than the members of the family. People complain because children can't pray in school, but few parents encourage them to pray at home. Home is a school for character, where we learn to love, listen, obey, and serve. In short, it's where we learn to be responsible. The fourth practical consideration that I want to bring out, that we want to take from 1 Kings, concerns Rehoboam and the fact that generations must work together. Whether it's in the home, in the chambers of government, or in the local congregation, generations must work together and learn from each other. Solomon's son Rehoboam foolishly turned a deaf ear to the experience and advice of his older counselors, and he chose to win only the applause of his fellow peers. And as a result, he lost most of his kingdom. By putting labels on different generations and letting them do their own thing, we've weakened social solidarity. We've divided the family. We've cut whole generations off from the heritage of the past, and we've convinced young people that they really can make it alone. You know, maybe it should be the case that we not have youth groups and young married groups and senior groups within the church, but that all should be together all the time and work together to learn from each other, to help each other, to grow and to mature. Well, getting back to the family itself, God has decreed that parents shall be older than their children. He's also commanded parents to love their children, to teach them how to listen and obey, to protect them from evil, and to be good examples before them. But parents can also learn from their children. It's a two-way street. The older generation hands the next generation a valuable heritage from the past. But if we don't understand the world they're living in and the way they feel about it, we can't help them use that heritage for their good and the good of society. You know, Paul saw the local church as the family of God, with one generation ministering to another. Younger people treat the older folks as they would their parents or their grandparents, and older Christians treat the younger ones as they would their own children. That's the way it should be in the home, in the church, and in the nation. Well, the fifth practical consideration that I want us to take from 1 Kings concerns Jeroboam. And this time I want us to think about wasted opportunities. God offered Jeroboam a priceless opportunity to build the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of the north, for the glory of God. But he wasted that opportunity. Instead of looking back to David and imitating his leadership and looking up to the Lord for help, Jeroboam let his ego take over and did things his own way. He invented his own religion to make it easy for the people to disobey the Lord. He abandoned the divine authority of God's word, and he appointed priests who were unqualified. God sent him signs and messages, but he refused to submit. The sins of Jeroboam are mentioned over 20 times in Scripture. The division of the Jewish nation was a tragedy. But if both Rehoboam and Jeroboam had listened to the Lord, they could have rescued both kingdoms from ruin. Once opportunity is lost, it won't be repeated. Each opportunity is a test of the vision and values of the people in charge. The Lord gave Jeroboam a sure promise in chapter 11, verses 29 through 40 of 1 Kings. But the king wouldn't take it seriously, and he would not trust God to fulfill it. Opportunity doesn't shout, it whispers, and our ears must be attentive. Opportunity knocks, it doesn't kick down the door, and we had better be alert to open the door. The American poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote these words, "For of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." To ignore God-given opportunity is to waste the past, jeopardize the future, and frustrate the present. The sixth consideration that I want us to take from 1 Kings concerns Baal, and more specifically, the insidious cancer of idolatry. Jeroboam put up his golden calves, and Jezebel brought in Baal worship. And before long, the people of the northern kingdom had turned from Jehovah to the worship of dumb idols. An idol is not only an insult to God, but it's an insult to man. For men and women were created in the image of God to reflect the glory of the true and living God. But to create a God in your own image, or in the image of the created order, and to worship it, is a dangerous thing. Because according to Psalm 115 and verse 8, we become like the gods we worship. If you want to be religious and still enjoy the pleasures of sin, then the worship of idols is the road to take. But its freedom leads to bondage, and its pleasures eventually lead to pain and death. Whether the idol we worship is money, prestige, authority, sex, entertainment, or our own self-righteous satisfaction, it can never equal what we receive when we worship the true and living God through His Son, Jesus Christ. The seventh practical consideration from 1 Kings is concerning Elijah and the fact of reformation and renewal. A nation, a congregation, a family, or an individual is never so far gone that the Lord can't give a new beginning. Elijah was Ahab's enemy because Ahab was following his own agenda and not the Lord's. Elijah was God's servant, and he risked his life to bring the nation back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. True reformation should lead to spiritual renewal. It isn't enough to tear down the pagan altars and remove the priests of Baal. We must rebuild the Lord's altar and ask God for new fire from heaven, so to speak, to consume the sacrifices. Well, reformation means getting rid of the new, unauthorized things to get back to the foundations of the old things. When Israel abandoned her covenant with Jehovah, she ceased to be the people of God and became like the other nations. The beautiful temple that once housed the glory of God became a pile of ruins that bore witness to the sins of an ungrateful and unbelieving people. God's chosen people forgot their glorious past and deliberately manufactured a future that brought shame and ruin. The key issue in any nation's faith has always been the struggle between the true prophets and the false prophets, both of whom claim to speak in the name of the Lord. What we mean here by prophets are the elders and preachers of the Lord's church today. They're not called prophets. They are called, as I said, elders and preachers. The false prophets tell us what we want to hear, while the true prophets tell us what we need to hear. The false prophets don't make a deep and thorough diagnosis of the congregation's sicknesses. They barely scratch the surface. True prophets cut deep and expose the hidden cancers. Like John the Baptizer, they apply the axe to the root of the trees, and they don't waste their time plucking off dead leaves from the dying branches. The eighth practical consideration that we want to take from 1 Kings concerns Ahab and Jezebel, specifically the abuse of power. One way that one might describe Ahab and Jezebel is that he was spineless and she was heartless, and together they were the embodiment of wickedness. If they were living today, Hollywood would make a feature movie about them, and they'd be featured in a miniseries on television. Cameras in hand, the press would follow their every move and report every activity in detail. It would make no difference that Ahab and Jezebel were godless unbelievers who lacked character and high ideals. The public feeds its sick imagination on that kind of garbage and keeps asking for more. How many of you are following the Kardashians or the Osbournes? Sickening is what it is. Thanks to sinful humanity, there's always more to be had. Page through a review of the 20th century and marvel at how the nations of the world ever survived such a concerted abuse of power on the part of many leaders. Much of it was brutal, leading to the annihilation of millions of innocent people. Some of it was done with finesse, the abusers wearing their white gloves, but it still led to destruction. Abusers who didn't use knives and guns and ovens used words. Well, whether it's administrative power, financial power, physical and mental power, or the ultimate power of life and death, the power that we have comes from God and must be used according to His will. Kings and queens, emperors and prime ministers, dictators and generals, parents and teachers, all of them are accountable to the Lord and will one day answer to Him. King Jesus is the greatest example of the right use of authority. He is a servant who leads and a leader who serves. And He does it because He loves us. Well, the ninth practical consideration I want us to take from 1 Kings is that God is sovereign. Since the days of Job, people have been trying to make sense out of what goes on in this world, and nobody has yet discovered the key. We have a hard enough time predicting the weather, let alone fully understanding the dynamics of history or even the personal situations in our own lives. Knowing that our God is sovereign in all things gives us the courage and faith that we need to live and serve in this sinful world. According to Psalm 33, verses 10 and 11, the Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the peoples of no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of His heart to all generations. But we need to remember that the sovereignty of God works in conjunction with the free will of man. He has given us the right to make choices and decisions, and He will not force His will upon us. But if He isn't allowed to rule, He will overrule. In spite of our resistance and rebellion, His will shall be done on earth as it is in heaven. He runs the universe by His wise decrees, and He doesn't call a committee meeting to find the consensus of His creatures. Man's will is free because God is sovereign. A God less than sovereign could not bestow moral freedom upon His creatures. He would be afraid to do so, writes one particular person. Yet, how long-suffering God is with both the saved and the lost. He allowed Jezebel to kill some of the prophets of the Lord, and He allowed Elijah to run away in fear. The greatest judgment that God can send is to allow people to have their own way and then suffer the consequences. How long, O Lord, how long? Says Psalm 13, verses 1 and 2. And this has been the painful prayer of Christians on earth and in heaven. Revelation 6 and verse 10. But our lives are in His hands, and He knows the end from the beginning. The book of 1 Kings has revealed to us the sin of man, the faithfulness of a loving God, and the seriousness of being a part of God's people. Before Jesus returns to take us to the judgment, many things are going to get worse, and we may become discouraged. We might even be tempted to quit. Then we'll remember that responsibility means our ability to respond and act appropriately. That brings us to the end of 1 Kings. In our next session, we'll begin our study of 2 Kings. I hope that you're learning something from these lectures. I hope you're gaining knowledge and growing in your faith and your maturity by what we've said. If we've said anything you don't understand, or something you just want to know more about, please get in touch with me. I'll be glad to help you any way I can. Thank you.